All right. 1 second here. Let me get a sip. Yeah, it's that Sasquatch coffee. Hey, first and foremost, I want to say thank you guys so very much for being so patient with me. I know that I've been busy this fall with a lot of things on my plate here at home, and of course, I work online, and it's just been really busy this fall. So here's the deal. As I said, I was going to try to start putting out one story a month, and I'm actually going to be trying to put out one every couple weeks, if at all possible. And I think that on average, it should be pretty possible. I know I used to do these things once a week for you, and I wish I still could, but I'm still pretty busy with a lot of things. At home with homeschooling and working online, getting websites built for folks and businesses, and working with companies and things like that. So it gets a little hectic and a little busy. But here's the deal: I am going to literally be trying to put on an awesome little encounter story here, put it up for you every other week. And right now, I've got some going on between this one and Christmas. I've got three or four coming out, so working on them right now. And of course, I've got this week's ready to go just in time for the Gobbler season. And I want to say thank you guys so very much. All of this stuff, the domain name, the hosting, and everything that I need to do here for you is paid through you guys just sitting through the commercials there, the advertising right before the videos here. And I really greatly appreciate that. It does cover everything I need to do here for you, so I do appreciate that. And that's really it. So God bless you guys for that. Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready for some clearing of the throat and nose and reading of a awesome PacWest Bigfoot encounter story? Let's do this. All right. Turkey hunting turns into a Bigfoot scare outside of Rogue River, Oregon. My name is Charlie, and I'm a lifelong resident of Rogue River, Oregon. Mostly I lived out in Evans Valley, closer to Wimer, really, but today I live in town. My encounter story happened when I was in high school, a junior high at the time, nearly 2.5 decades ago. But it was while turkey hunting with a friend that we got the scare of our lives one evening by a real, live Bigfoot. All joking aside, it was the craziest moments of my life, and yes, these things are real, as the turkey we were hunting. Funny thing was, we should have known better. The Queen's Branch Bigfoot. Growing up in Oregon and the stories of reports of Bigfoot is a part of the culture, I suppose. Even before my encounter, when I was not a believer, I still heard of them here and there, and heard a few crazy things out here myself in the middle of the night. Sometimes during hunting and camping and other outings with my family or friends, we would share the stories to scare each other, just like any other normal family. Well, hopefully, most normal families do. Anyways, I heard the stories, and to be honest, I had heard more than just stories from one person rather frequently. And this is the reason I should have known better as to what was happening at that crazy and scary moment. Down the road from us we had an older gentleman, called himself an old timer, at least who had been around the Evans Valley area since he was born. He had hunted all the areas you could hunt around the area, and had some of the craziest stories I'd ever heard anyone tell. Some were, of course, about Bigfoot, and what he called the crazy devils that lived up in the mountains around the area. Yes, I heard some pretty weird things at night growing up, like I said, especially this far out of town. But his stories, they were pretty scary, to be honest. Wild Bill. Wild Bill. That was what he asked us to call him. And for the last 30 years of my life, I have. I actually worked. I actually worked for him on and off growing up. He would pay me a bit here and there during the fall and winter months to do some yard work for him and help him with the garden in the spring here and there. It gave me money to spend in town with friends, so that was all right with my parents and great for me. There were the stories he'd share from time to time, but one in particular grabbed my attention. Even to today, it scares the crud out of me. It was about an incident with his dad and a friend of his who'd gone out hunting nearby, and his friend was nearly killed by one of those mountain devils, or Bigfoot as we know them. I remember that story well, and when he told it, you knew Wild Bill was not making it up. You could just tell, I suppose. But it went like this. His father, he said, was out doing some hunting in mid-October, way back in the day. He was not alone. He was with his best friend at the time. Both worked in the lumber industry that was screaming busy back then. They decided to head up one Saturday morning pretty far up Pleasant Creek. How far they were, I do not know. I don't think they were as far as Brushy Gulch, but they were pretty far up, he said. It was dark still when they arrived, and they decided to split up, one person on one side and the other on the other side of the creek. And to make a long part of this story short, he had never expected a legend to come to life, but it did. It was almost immediately on arriving and crossing that creek, too. It started with a rock hitting the creek and making a big cracking kind of sound as it hit another rock sticking up out of the creek itself. Then it happened. Without warning, a large, massive, bipedal and hairy monster, as his dad would describe it, came out from behind a tall hedge of brush and trees and literally hit his friend, sending him flying into the cold water of the creek, practically knocking him out cold. At that moment, his dad pulled the trigger on his 30-30, and that thing ran off faster than anything he'd ever seen run. He was freaking out, keeping his eyes on the forest as he dragged his buddy to the shore and out of the cold water. His friend barely saw the thing, he said. All he knew was something large and massive came flying at him from the corner of his eye and hit him real hard. Wild Bill's dad told him what he saw and in which direction it took off. They both left the area immediately and never hunted that place again. The rest of the story. Now, my friend and I would not be out that way, but we would come across a very aggressive Bigfoot ourselves, something we, too, were not sure existed. But I did have the thought it could in the back of my mind, and for very good reason. Living out this far, basically just up past the turnoff onto Queens Branch Road for most of my life, I've heard some pretty crazy things coming from the woods and mountains beyond. Things that really did creep me out growing up. Once in a while, and my mom could attest to this, we heard some pretty crazy screaming sounds coming from the woods. It was like a howling and screaming at times that would cause me to get up and close my window at night sometimes. But was that Bigfoot? I'm not really sure, but I do know they exist now. I had some friends out this way that heard crazy things from time to time, too. So, I was not alone wondering what was out here in the woods, nor was I alone the day this encounter happened, and would actually see a Bigfoot. Wild turkey. So it was turkey hunting time, and a good friend of mine decided we should head out and see what we could do about getting ourselves a turkey that year. Of course, we would buy a turkey as well, at least my family would, even if I bagged one. We decided we'd head up Queens Branch Road and up past where it ends to do our hunting. Yes, I could have just hung out on my front porch, but getting out of the house is one of the reasons we hunt in the first place, right? Sounds funny, and it is, but it's also true. Anyway, we would head out on a Friday morning early, just before dawn actually. We finally pulled over after climbing up pretty high into the hills, or what some would call mountains, if you're not from around here. It was still dark when we arrived, but it did not take long before the light started to break. Like I said before, it did not take long before everything we experienced happened, but it was not as quick as you might think either. We did get some hunting in for a few. Once we parked just off the side of the road, we were basically perched up top a hillside, looking down into a sort of ravine that below that, about 100 yards, became a small semi-flat area that sloped gently down again at the end of it into the valley below. We walked quietly down just to the edge of the small plateau, but no further. There were no birds, but we saw some sign of a gaggle of turkeys that had come through within hours. So we thought they'd probably come back, and so we took our positions just inside the tree line and about 15 feet apart from each other. And to basically correct that, I believe it's actually a gang of turkeys and not a gaggle. I think that's a gaggle of geese. That's not a gaggle of turkey. It did not take long, but the sun was peeking over the hills to see around us a bit more when we thought we were in the right spot at the right time. But boy, were we wrong. There was some movement to the right of us. Nothing that seemed to give away the massiveness of what it really was. It was just movement to the brush, as if something was slowly moving through it. My friend looked at me with a big grin, with his thumb sticking out and waving and back and forth and in the direction the sound was coming from. It was not a second later that he looked at me as my face went ashen, and I had the look of horror in my eyes, and rightfully so. I was suddenly paralyzed with fear at what I was looking at. I watched as a monster stood up quickly and suddenly and was looking right at my buddy. He quickly turned his head to see the large, solid, black in color and ugly monster for himself. We were both frozen with fear. At least neither of us moved a single hair. Neither did the Bigfoot. My mind, I admit, was not ready for anything like this. Processing what I was seeing was at first impossible, but after a few seconds, I knew I was staring at a Bigfoot. All three of us stood there without moving. Well, we were squatting, and it was standing. It stood there staring at first. Its face had a kind of scowl on it, I suppose. Either way, it was pretty scary. It was a pretty scary looking animal. His face was crazy looking. I can't really compare it to anything known to me except for a bit apish and weird, but scarier. Much scarier. Even through the hair. It was huge, as in, I'm guessing around 8, 9 feet tall. His chest was wide, almost as wide as I am tall. At least it seemed so. Its arms were hidden behind the brush at first, but they seemed very, very long and extremely muscular. It was covered in hair, including its face, except right around the eyes, which were dark and almost hollow-looking, to be honest. Suddenly, without warning, that thing charged at my friend and did not stop until it was practically screaming in his face. My friend started screaming himself, and the next thing I saw was him being hit with this monster's forearm and falling down backwards. This thing moved like lightning. I mean, it was really, really fast. I never heard one of these things and all the stories being so violent so quickly up to that point, except for with Wild Bill. But there was reason we'd come to realize why it was. I let off a shot of my shotgun. It moved off just as fast as it came. I grabbed my buddy by his arm, lifting him up off the ground. He was okay, just in shock about what had happened. Later that day, he'd admit he thought he was going to die for a split second there. We both started back up the hillside, but that Bigfoot, basically cut us off all of a sudden as it moved between us and the road above. Again, I let off a shot and reloaded as fast as possible. We noticed, well, my buddy did, a small game trail to the right, so we took that and figured we'd cut up the second we could. It was not 50 feet away down that trail that we saw 3 or more wild turkey on the ground and one in a tree, dead, with heads and wings ripped off. I think at that moment I knew what happened. We walked right into a Bigfoot kill and hunt. That filled me full of dread, suddenly, and I looked over at my friend whose face was now as white and ashen as mine was moments ago. Again. Suddenly that thing was about 60 feet to our left and screamed, and I swear it was a pretty familiar scream I'd heard from the hills at night growing up. I finally knew where the sounds originated. Up here, from a real-life Bigfoot. It was so loud it literally hurt my eardrums. But We took advantage of its position and started moving up the hill and towards the road as fast as we could. It kept up the screaming and the chasing of us, but I think because of the shots I let off, it kept its distance. And I think it was mad because we were now near its kill, but we moved on as fast as we could. I felt something hit my back seconds later, too, as we moved up the hill. It was probably a small rock, which surprised me. We kept moving faster and faster until we reached the road, and that's when we found ourselves about 50 or so yards south of our car. The sun was up enough to see just fine, and boy did we. That Bigfoot was not alone. Suddenly, as it moved in and out of the trees below us, we noticed another one just below it moving as well. Each one started screaming and letting off some other noise I can't really attribute any sort of similarity to. It was just strange. I was really scared then as small rocks, sticks, and even some large pine cones came flying at us from the woods, and the threatening sounds did not stop. Finally, however, as we came around a bend, we spotted our vehicle through the woods. We got in and peeled out of there as fast as we could. Turkey hunting was over for the year, and me hunting up that way would not happen again for another 4 or so years. But eventually I did go back, and I have to say my dad and uncle kept telling me to shut up about my story all the way up there, and while we were hunting. I did walk down there, back to the exact area of our incident with my uncle. I did not want to go alone. I noticed nothing, no dead turkey, no sign of anything but deer all over the place. I was pretty apprehensive and a little on edge, and my uncle could tell. Seconds later, he just looked at me and said, "I believe you." Well, that sure made me feel a ton better. But that is my encounter story. Thanks. Happy Thanksgiving. Charlie.